Now, Israel is pressing ahead with a large-scale raid in the occupied West Bank. It says the operation in Jenin is aimed at countering what it calls hundreds of terrorist attacks. Palestinian authorities say 10 people have been killed and 35 others injured. They accuse Israel of collective punishment and said the raid was part of an Israeli plan aimed at gradually annexing the occupied West Bank. DW's Tanya Kremer has this report.
A long queue in the morning hours in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. An Israeli military checkpoint is stopping people leaving this village.
We've been waiting here since early this morning, so we've been here half a day, just stuck here, sitting in our car, as you can see.
Others give up, opting to proceed on foot instead. Taxis are waiting on the main road, ready to pick them up.
The situation is expected to get worse in the coming days. The Israelis are saying they'll raid the cities and there will be more closures.
Roadblocks and checkpoints, this is nothing new for Palestinians here in the occupied West Bank. But they say that the situation has become worse. And they also say they feel like this is collective punishment. Across the West Bank, residents reported closures and long waiting hours at checkpoints. The military said they have expanded inspections. And since Tuesday, the Israeli military has been conducting a new large-scale military raid, including airstrikes on the Jenin refugee camp, targeting Palestinian militants. Israeli officials say it's a counter-terrorism operation and released this material from their incursion inside the camp. The streets surrounding the Jenin camp are empty and shops are closed. Reports from inside say bulldozers have destroyed infrastructure, roads and water pipes. For residents, the situation has become unbearable. While this is not the first raid in recent months, the scale of the new Israeli operation was unexpected.
They are done with Gaza. Now they came to us here, to the West Bank, to take revenge on us. There's a lot of fear that civilians are not safe here.
Another Israeli checkpoint outside of Jenin in the evening. It takes hours to cross, making life for ordinary Palestinians even more complicated.
I asked Middle East analyst Harold Horev from Tel Aviv University about the timing of Israel's operation in the West Bank.
Well, obviously, because some of the units, or many of the units and divisions, are now free to deal with the West Bank. That is posing a major threat in the past year of the war. The main threat in the West Bank, Anya, are what we call the battalions, and what the Palestinians call the battalions, which are self-formed units on a very local basis for each city. You have one in Nablus, one in Tulkarem, and in Jenin, of course, and they are posing a major threat on the roads. And all sorts of attacks, not only against the army, but also against settlers, against Israelis within the so-called Green Line. And they were not dealt with during or on a significant basis in the past year. And we see a growing escalation. Just last week, three Israelis were killed by those battalions, and the IDF is dealing with it now.
So you're saying that these battalions are the sole focus, or is there a broader strategy for the region in what we're seeing here?
From the Israeli side, obviously, there is a broader strategy to deal with this phenomena within the Palestinian, I would say, society, actually, because they are representing a social phenomena, which is interesting and fascinating by itself. They are not identified with the traditional organization that we know, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and so on, but rather backed up from behind by those organizations. They are representing something which is more independent, more Generation Z kind of phenomena, I would say, of youngsters who don't want to be identified with any one of the traditional organizations, but still they are backed up with the traditional terror organizations, which are supplying them with weapons, with money, vehicles, all kinds of things that eventually resulting in a major threat on Israelis.
Havel, do you see a potential here for an Israeli annexation of the West Bank?
Frankly, I don't think so. I know that obviously some of the parties in the government are pursuing such a thing, but you know, knowing what the previous Trump administration was willing to give in that sense, I think that yes, annexation on some parts of the West Bank, but not the whole West Bank. And as a matter of fact, by annexing some of the settlement, securing a Palestinian state, or a major part of the West Bank that would be allocated for the Palestinian state. I know it from firsthand because I was in a good contact with some of the previous administration officials. And I don't think in that manner things will be, I would say, significantly different.
Do you think, though, that this operation in the West Bank and the rising tensions between Israeli settlers and Palestinians, everything you've been talking about, do you think this will have a knock-on effect, therefore, on the ceasefire in Gaza?
Definitely, Anya, because, you know, things are highly connected. To begin with, October 7 was inspiring those battalions in the West Bank. They wanted to contribute their own share to the struggle, but you know that there was a void between what they experienced and what the Gaza Strip experienced, for good and bad. They didn't experience the same terrible situation in Gaza, but still they wanted to, you know, to contribute their own share. Israel, from its own consideration, could not deal with it on a high scale. But now this is probably the time in the view of the IDF and the Israeli government to deal with it, because we do see objectively escalation of the operations against Israelis, and it's highly dangerous.
Havel Horev, Middle East analyst in Tel Aviv. Havel, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Anya.
For more, I'm joined by Mayrav Zoncha, and she is a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group in Tel Aviv. Mayrav, thanks for joining us. Why would you say Israel has launched this major operation in the West Bank right now, just days after a ceasefire in Gaza?
Well, as your correspondent mentioned, this is not anything new, but it has accelerated, and the Palestinian Authority was the one operating in Jenin up until recently, and now Israel has gone in. And in a lot of ways, we're seeing the Gazification of the West Bank in terms of the air raids, drone strikes, the infrastructure destruction. It's very similar methods and tactics. It's very possible that Israel is doing this now to send a message that even though there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we continue to occupy, control, and dictate the terms of Palestinian life in the West Bank. Israel has de facto been annexing the West Bank for decades, and with much more acceleration since October 7th and since this far-right government came into power. It's also possible that Smotrich, the finance minister, who is also the de facto governor of the West Bank in the Israeli Defense Ministry, that he was promised by Netanyahu that in exchange for this pause in Gaza, he could ramp up the situation in the West Bank. Now, Israel does have an issue with acts of terror and violence, and they have increased. But again and again, Israel has entered Jenin, and these types of operations have never proved to be effective in stopping these kinds of actions.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that this might be the moment that Israel decides to annex the West Bank and keep Gaza in a sort of a limbo, his words there. Is that how you see the Israeli government plans here?
I think we have to wait and see what exactly the Trump administration is trying to do, if it is going to put its weight behind keeping the ceasefire going in Gaza. But there is no doubt that in the Israeli government and in the Trump administration, there are people who believe in greater Israel, who are annexationists, who don't want Palestinians to have a state or self-determination. But I think that Netanyahu specifically has a very clear strategy of wanting to keep control of the West Bank without formally annexing it, because the minute Israel formally annexes the West Bank, it changes the legal implications that it has. It becomes a lot more obvious to everybody. And again, as I said, while we are speaking now, Israel de facto has annexed the West Bank in the sense that it has all the control over everything in all of the West Bank. So it de facto does it anyway. The question is whether a formal annexation would be tied to some kind of bigger deal related to the Trump administration's plan with Saudi normalization and what they claim would be some kind of, deal of the century style 2.0 with giving parts of the West Bank to the Palestinians. Again, this would not be a viable two-state solution, but it would allow Israel to annex parts of the West Bank. But what we're seeing now, I think, is not that. It's something else. It's a way for the far right to feel like it still is in power and is still on its agenda while the Gaza ceasefire continues.
We'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks so much for joining us, Merav Sunshine from the International Crisis Group. Thanks so much.